No one saved her a seat that autumn, and it was this, more than anything else, that told her the decision had already been made without her, filed away in some ledger she was not permitted to see, signed by a hand she had never met and would not meet for many months yet. The card came by messenger on a Tuesday, small and cream-coloured and edged in the Opera House's customary gold, and it said only that the box her father had held for 11 years had been reassigned, that her subscription was cancelled effective immediately, that no further correspondence on the matter would be entertained. She read it once, standing in the doorway of the rooms she could no longer properly afford, and then she folded it along its original crease and put it in the drawer where she kept the other things that had once belonged to a different life. And she did not cry, because crying had never once returned to her anything that had been taken. If you have ever stood in a doorway holding proof that the world has quietly closed a door behind you, then you already understand her better than any description could manage. And if you have not, then perhaps by the end of this you will understand her anyway, because that is the particular use of a story like this one. Before we go further, if this kind of quiet reckoning is the sort of thing you find yourself returning to, you might stay a while and tell us so in the comments, because there is more of it here. Her name was Marguerite Voss, and on the morning the card arrived, she was 26 years old, unmarried, and in possession of exactly one skill that anyone in London still remembered belonged to her family, though few remembered it kindly. She did not weep over the card because she had already spent her weeping years before on a larger loss that the card was only the final small echo of, and so she set her jaw and she put on her coat and she walked the 11 streets to the Opera House, not to plead, not to protest, but because she had heard from a chorus girl who owed her a kindness that the instrument room beneath the stage was in a state of some disrepair, and that no one currently employed there knew how to properly set a soundpost or true a warped bridge, and that this, of all the doors still open to her, was the one she meant to walk through. The stage door was cold and smelled of tallow and dust, and the man who kept it, a stooped and suspicious person named Pruitt, who had held the post for 30 years and trusted almost no one who had not first proven themselves useful, looked at her plain dress and her unremarkable hands and did not immediately see anything worth his time. She did not argue with him. She simply asked whether she might look at the instruments that were sitting unused, and when he refused her twice, she asked a third time, quietly, without heat, and something in her patience, a patience that was not politeness but discipline, the kind of person builds only by surviving something, made him finally step aside. What she found in that low stone room, among cases gone soft with damp and strings gone black with age, would occupy the whole of her winter, though she did not know that yet, standing there with her cold hands on a cracked viola that had once, long ago, in another building entirely, belonged to someone she had loved very much. But this is not truly where her history begins, and if we are to understand why a woman with such steady hands and such an unbending back came to be standing alone in a damp instrument room asking a suspicious old man for permission to work, we must go back, further than that Tuesday, back nearly 15 years, to a much finer room in a much finer building, where her father, Anton Voss, once stood at the height of his profession and did not yet know that it was about to end. Anton Voss had been in his time the most sought-after restorer and maker of stringed instruments south of Vienna, a craftsman whose violins were said to sing with a particular warmth that no other maker in London could reproduce, and for 11 years he had held, by personal arrangement with old Duke Aldrich of Camborne-Shee, both a private workshop attached to the Opera House and the finest box in the house itself, a mark of patronage rare enough that other men in his trade spoke of it with open envy. He was not a nobleman and never pretended to be one, but he carried himself with the particular dignity of a man who has earned every inch of his position through work rather than birth. And his daughter, small and watchful even then, spent her childhood evenings not in a nursery, but seated on a stool beside his workbench, learning the weight of a well-carved scroll and the sound a healthy bass bar makes under careful fingers, learning it the way other children learn their letters, without ever quite noticing she was being taught. The old Duke died when she was 11, and his son, the young Duke Edmund Aldrich, inherited the title, the estates, and the patronage arrangements, along with everything else. And it was in the settling of that inheritance that the trouble began, quietly at first, the way trouble in great houses so often does, buried in correspondence rather than announced in scenes. The new Duke's steward, a cold and efficient man, determined to prove his usefulness by trimming every expense his predecessor had allowed to grow comfortable, decided that a workshop and a private box, given freely to a tradesman, however skilled, was an indulgence the estate no longer required. And he said as much in a letter that Anton Voss received on an ordinary Thursday and read twice before setting down without a word. The young Duke himself never met Anton Voss to deliver the news in person. He simply allowed the letter to be sent, the workshop to be reassigned, the debts that had accumulated during 2 lean years of ill health to be called in all at once rather than allowed the grace period every previous patron had extended. Through nothing more dramatic than paperwork and inattention, a man who had spent 30 years building something fine was quietly and efficiently unmade. It was not cruelty exactly, or not the kind that announces itself. It was simply what indifference looks like when it is wearing a signet ring, and Marguerite, watching her father's hands begin to shake, not from age, but from a grief he would not name, learned in that single winter the particular bitterness of being ruined by a man who had never once bothered to learn her father's face. Her father did not recover the workshop, and he did not recover, in any full sense, at all. He took smaller work where he could find it, mending village fiddles and school violins for fees that would once have insulted him, and Marguerite no longer permitted the stool beside the workbench, because there was no longer a proper workbench to sit beside, learned instead at his side in whatever rented room they occupied that season, absorbing everything he had left to give her, which was, in the end, everything that mattered. He taught her to listen to wood the way other fathers taught their daughters to listen to music, to run a thumb along a crack and know its age, to understand that a soundpost set a half-millimeter wrong could silence an instrument as surely as a broken string, to believe, above all, that good work, done quietly, was its own answer to a world that had stopped paying attention. He taught her, too, without ever quite saying so aloud, that bitterness was a luxury they could not afford to keep, that a person could carry an injustice forever without ever once allowing it to curdle into something that consumed her. And this lesson, he died 3 years after the letter arrived, of a chest complaint that a doctor with better fees might have caught earlier. On the morning of his funeral, which was small, and attended mostly by tradesmen who had known him in better years, Marguerite stood at the graveside in a borrowed black dress and made herself a private promise that had nothing to do with revenge, because revenge had never interested her, and everything to do with continuation. She did not know, standing there, how many years it would take before that promise found its shape, or that the young Duke, who had signed nothing personally, but had allowed everything to happen, would one day sit in a box built by the very man he had ruined, listening to music restored by the very hands he had never bothered to notice existed. She knew only that she had inherited 2 things from her father, a set of skills that no fashionable school would ever teach a woman, and a private ledger, kept not on paper, but somewhere steadier, in which she recorded, without malice, every kindness and every cruelty that came her way, waiting to see, in her own time, which would eventually outweigh the other. For years afterward, she supported herself as best she could, taking in mending and copying music by lamplight and occasionally, in rooms where no one thought to ask her name, quietly repairing an instrument for a fee well below what the work was worth, because the work itself was the only inheritance she had left, and she was not willing to let it go unused, simply because the world had decided a woman's hands belonged elsewhere. So when Pruitt finally stepped aside that cold Tuesday and let her into the instrument room beneath the stage, she was not a stranger to this work, whatever he assumed of her plain dress and her unremarkable hands, and she moved through the room with the unhurried certainty of someone returning to a language she had never actually forgotten. She catalogued what she found, the way her father had once taught her to catalogue a workshop after a long absence. Which cases held instruments merely neglected and which held instruments actively dying, which cracks could wait a season, which strings were simply old and which had been strung wrong from the start by someone who had never properly learned the craft. She asked Pruitt for a workbench, and he gave her grudgingly a corner table and a single lamp, and she asked for nothing else. Not payment, not recognition, not even a proper introduction to the musicians whose instruments she meant to save, because she had learned long ago that asking for too much too quickly. She began with a cracked viola that no one in the orchestra had played in 2 years, working through a series of cold afternoons with glue and clamps and a patience that seemed to Pruitt almost unnatural in someone so young, and by the second week the viola no longer sat silent in its case but sang, quietly, in a way that made the young violinist who first tried it stop mid-phrase and simply stare at the instrument in her hands as though it had been replaced by a different one entirely. Word of this did not travel loudly, because Marguerite gave it no reason to. She did not announce her father's name or her family's history, did not explain where she had learned what she knew, only continued arriving each morning at the same hour, working through the same, and returning home each evening with her hands smelling of varnish and her ledger, private and unspoken, growing by small and steady entries. By the time the first frost came, she had repaired 4 instruments beyond what anyone had thought possible, and Pruitt, who trusted almost no one, had begun leaving the workshop key with her rather than locking it each night himself, a gesture so small that neither of them remarked on it. By December, she had moved from the smaller instruments to the harder work, the cellos and the double basses whose damage was structural rather than cosmetic, whose repair required not just careful hands, but a kind of patient courage, because a wrong cut in the wrong place could ruin an instrument beyond any future saving. And she made none of those wrong cuts, not once, all winter. In January, word reached the orchestra's conductor, a stern and exacting man named Halloway, who had spent a decade complaining privately about the state of the house's instruments and being told each time that there was no money and no craftsman worth the expense, that something remarkable was happening in the room beneath the stage. And he came down one evening, unannounced, to see for himself. He found a young woman in a plain dress, bent over a double bass with a fine chisel, entirely absorbed, and when he asked her, somewhat abruptly, where she had trained, she answered him plainly, without embellishment, that she had trained at her father's bench, and gave no further name, and something in the steadiness of her answer, the complete absence of either apology or boast, made him decide not to press further. He began, instead, quietly sending her more work and quietly telling other musicians, in the careful way men like Halloway recommend things they do not wish to be seen recommending too openly, that the girl in the instrument room was worth trusting with anything that mattered. A year passed in this fashion, marked not by any single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of small, steady proofs. An instrument saved here, a musician's gratitude, expressed quietly there, and by the following autumn the room beneath the stage that had once held instruments dying of neglect held instead a small, thriving workshop that half the orchestra had come without ever quite deciding to depend upon. She was not paid well, not at first, and she was not thanked publicly, not ever, but she had not come looking for either of those things, and what she found instead, slowly, without ever seeking it, was something closer to belonging than she had felt in the 11 years since her father's workshop. On the fourth morning of a particularly hard February, the coldest anyone could remember, she arrived to find that someone had left a small brazier burning in the corner of her workroom overnight, unasked, unexplained, and though she never learned for certain who had done it, she suspected the chorus girls, who had taken to bringing her tea in chipped cups and sitting with her in companionable silence during their breaks, treating her without ceremony as one of their own. It was during this same season that Duke Edmund Aldrich began, for reasons he could not entirely have named even to himself, to notice that something in his opera house had changed. He was not by nature an inattentive man in the way his steward had once made him seem. He had simply been young when the arrangement with Anton Voss was severed, more concerned with the general management of an inheritance too large and too complicated for his years than with the fate of one tradesman among many, and in the 15 years since, he had built around himself the particular blankness that men of his station learn as a form of armor, a controlled unreadability that allowed him to move through obligations and negotiations and the endless small cruelties of estate management. But sitting in his box one evening in early spring, listening to a performance that struck him, without his being able to say precisely why, as unusually fine, he found himself distracted not by the singers, but by the orchestra beneath them, by a richness in the lower strings he did not remember hearing in previous seasons, and when he mentioned this, almost idly, to Halloway during the interval, the conductor's answer was brief and oddly evasive. Something about improvements to the instrument stock that he did not particularly wish to elaborate on. The Duke, whose blankness had never quite extended to incuriosity, found this evasion more interesting than any full explanation would have been, and over the following weeks he began asking small questions of small people, the box attendants, the ushers, Pruitt himself, and receiving each time the same careful deflecting answers, as though everyone in his employ had silently agreed to protect something or someone from his notice. This unease was new to him, and he did not enjoy it. He was a man accustomed to knowing the shape of everything in his domain, and the discovery that a room beneath his own stage held some quiet, well-guarded activity that half his staff seemed to regard with something close to reverence unsettled him in a way that no ledger discrepancy or tenant dispute ever had. He told himself it was simple curiosity about the management of his own property, nothing more, and told himself this several times with diminishing success as the spring wore on and the unease did not fade, but instead sharpened, quietly, into something closer to fascination. He did not go looking for her directly, not at first, because a man of his position did not typically concern himself with the affairs of a workshop, and some stubborn remnant of pride kept him from simply asking Pruitt to explain himself plainly. Instead, he began arriving at the opera house earlier than his performances required, walking corridors he had not walked in years, and it was on one such evening, in April, that he first saw her without knowing who she was, a woman in a plain grey dress crossing the lower passage with a violin case under one arm, moving with the unhurried, purposeful step of someone entirely at ease in a building he had, until recently, believed he understood completely. He did not approach her that evening, only watched her disappear through the door to the instrument room, and asked, the following morning in a tone he made deliberately casual, who exactly the young woman was who worked below the stage. Halloway's answer was careful, again guarded in the same way it had been before, offering only that she was a skilled restorer who had done a great deal of good work for the house, and when the Duke pressed for a name, the conductor hesitated a moment too long before giving it, and the name, Voss, landed in the room with a weight the conductor clearly understood, and the Duke, for one disorienting moment, did not. It took him the length of a single held breath to place it, to travel backward through 15 years of correspondence he had signed, without reading closely enough, to arrive at the memory of a steward's letter and a workshop reassigned, a decision made in his name during a season when he had been too young and too overwhelmed to properly weigh its cost. The unease that had been building in him for weeks resolved in that instant into something far more specific and far less comfortable, a recognition that the very warmth he had admired in his own orchestra had been restored to it by the daughter of the man his household had quietly ruined, and that she had done this work not for him, not seeking his notice or his gratitude, but simply because the work itself demanded doing, and she had been the one capable of it. He did not sleep well that night, and the following morning, rather than send for her formally, which some instinct told him would only cause her to close herself off entirely, he went instead to his own estate archives, where correspondence from his father's era was kept in careful, dusty order, and asked to see the file concerning the Opera House patronage arrangements from 15 years before. What he found there was worse, in its way, than he had expected, not because the record revealed any single act of deliberate cruelty, but because it revealed the opposite, a series of small, bloodless, administrative decisions made by a steward eager to prove his economy and approved, apparently, by the Duke's own younger self, with barely a second glance, that had together dismantled a man's livelihood with the same indifference one might apply to trimming an overgrown hedge. He found the original letter calling in Anton Voss's debts, found his own boyish signature at the bottom approving the steward's recommendations for that quarter, a signature given, he now remembered, with some discomfort, in the middle of a dozen other decisions on a busy afternoon, without ever once picturing the man on the other end of it. He sat with this file for the better part of an evening, and when he finally set it down, he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives too late to be comfortable, that the woman working quietly beneath his stage had spent 15 years rebuilding, through nothing but patience and skill, the very thing his careless signature had taken from her family, and had done so without once asking him for anything at all. He went to find her himself. The next afternoon, descending the stone stairs to the instrument room alone, without announcement, without the retinue that usually accompanied a man of his rank into any space he intended to enter, and he found her exactly as he had glimpsed her before, bent over a cello with a fine brush in her hand, entirely absorbed in her work, a grey cat that had apparently taken up residence in the corner of the room, watching him from atop a stack of cases with the same unreadable stillness he himself had spent years cultivating. She looked up when his shadow crossed the doorway, and something in her face, he noted, did not change at all, did not soften into the deference he was accustomed to receiving, nor sharpen into the resentment he half expected to have earned, but remained simply, steadily composed. Whatever it turned out to be was not going to determine the shape of her day. He introduced himself unnecessarily, since she plainly already knew who he was, and she set down her brush and answered him with the same plain, unhurried courtesy she had once given Halloway, offering neither apology for her presence nor gratitude for his notice, as though daring him to make of it what he would. A pause. He asked, because he did not know how else to begin, whether she knew that the workshop she now occupied had once belonged, in a different form, to her father. She told him that she knew it very well, that she had in fact grown up on a stool beside a bench, not unlike the one behind her, and that she saw no particular reason to discuss the matter further unless he had come with some purpose beyond simple curiosity. A silence. It was not hostility in her voice, only the flat, factual clarity of someone who had spent 15 years learning not to perform her grief for the benefit of men who had never once had to earn their own place in a room. And the Duke, standing there in his fine coat amid the smell of varnish and old wood, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, entirely without the practiced blankness he usually wore into difficult conversations. He told her then plainly, and without the customary softening a man of his rank might have reached for, that he had spent the previous evening reading his father's old correspondence and had found in his own hand the approval that had ended her father's tenure, and that he did not intend to offer excuses for a decision he had made, however young and however busy, without ever once considering the man it would ruin. She listened to this without interrupting, her expression giving away very little, though the Duke noticed, or believed he noticed, a small stillness settle over her that had not been there a moment before, as though she had waited a very long time to hear precisely this, and had not entirely believed she ever would. When he finished, she said only that she appreciated his honesty more than she would have appreciated an apology, because an apology asked nothing of a man beyond the saying of it, while an honest accounting asked him to actually look at what had happened, and, looking, in her experience, was the harder and rarer thing. He asked, then somewhat unevenly, what she believed he owed her, and she told him without hesitation that she did not want his money and did not want his pity, that the workshop she had built beneath his stage was hers now, in every way that mattered, regardless of whose name was on the deed. The only one she would accept was recognition, plain and public, that the work being done there belonged to the daughter of Anton Voss, restorer, and not to some anonymous convenience the house had quietly acquired. It was, he realized, listening to her, not an act of forgiveness she was offering him, and not quite an act of continued anger either, but something steadier than either, a simple insistence on being seen accurately after so many years of being overlooked, as the most reasonable request anyone had ever made of him. The formal announcement, when it came, took the shape, not of a grand gesture, but of paperwork. The very medium through which her family's ruin had originally been enacted now turned, quite deliberately, to the opposite purpose. The Duke had the estate solicitors draw up a new arrangement, restoring to Marguerite Voss a permanent and properly compensated position as chief restorer to the Opera House. Her name entered formally into the house's records beside her father's original workshop charter, the two documents filed together at her own request, so that no future steward, however eager to trim expenses, could again claim ignorance of what had once been promised. He did not offer her the box, not directly, not as a gift, because he had come to understand, in the weeks since their first conversation, that she would refuse anything offered as charity, and so instead, on the evening of the season's final performance, simply arrived at the instrument room before curtain. Whether she would care to hear the results of a year's careful work from somewhere other than the wings, since, after all, he said, no one had thought to save her a seat the previous autumn, and he saw no reason that oversight should be allowed to stand. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face this time did soften, not into deference, but into something closer to recognition, the particular expression of a person deciding, after long practice in withholding trust, that it might finally be safe to extend a little. She came up with him to the box that had once belonged to her father, and sat beside the man whose careless signature had once taken it from him, and neither of them spoke much during the performance, because there was, by then, very little that needed explaining in words. Afterward, walking out through the same stone passage she had walked a year before, as a stranger asking permission to work, she passed the grey cat sitting in its customary place at the threshold, watching them both, with its old, unreadable patience, and she thought, not for the first time, that some things simply persist quietly until someone finally troubles to notice them properly. Smoke rose from the opera house chimneys into the cold night air as they left the same thin grey thread that had risen from that stage door every winter, of her working there, unremarked and unbroken. And it seemed to her, watching it climb, an apt enough image for what patience properly kept could eventually become, not loud, not sudden, but steady and warm and impossible in the end to overlook.